IaMA, after a 5-month search, I found 2 of my kidnapped friends who had been forced into marriage in China. For the past 6 years I've been a full-time volunteer with a grassroots organization to raise awareness of human trafficking, IaMA. You might remember my 2016 IaMA about my 3 teenaged friends who were kidnapped from their hometown in Vietnam and trafficked into China. They were lucky to be sold as brides, not brothel workers. 1 ran away and was brought home safely, the other 2 just disappeared. Nobody knew where they were, what had happened to them, or even if they were still alive. I gave up everything and risked my life to find the girls in China. To everyone's surprise, including my own, I did actually find them, but that was just the beginning. Both of my friends had given birth in China. Still just teenagers, they faced a heartbreaking dilemma. Each girl had to choose between her daughter and her own freedom. For 6 years I've been a full-time volunteer with the Human Earth Project to help fight the global human trafficking crisis. Of its 40 million victims, most are women sold for sex, and many are only girls. We recently released an award-winning documentary to tell my friends' stories, and are now fundraising to continue our anti-trafficking work. You can now check out the film for $1 and help support our work at Want to tour the documentary around North America and help rescue kidnapped girls. Proof. You can find proof and more information on the front page of our website at LL. Be here from 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for at least 3 hours. I might stay longer, depending on how many questions there are. Smiley face. Fire away. Edit. Questions are already pouring in way faster than I can answer them. I'll try to get to them all. Thanks for your patience. Smiley face. Big love to everyone who has contributed to help support our work. We really need funding to keep this organization alive. Your support makes a huge difference, and really means a lot to us. Thank you. Also, we have only 1 volunteer here responding to contributions. Please be patient with her, she's doing her best, and will send you the film, book, etc. as soon as she can. Smiley face. Edit number 2. Wow, the response here has just been overwhelming. I've been answering questions for 6 hours and it's definitely time for me to take a break. There are still a ton of questions down the bottom I didn't have a chance to get to, but most of them seem to be repeats of questions I've already answered higher up. Thank you so much for all your interest and support.
Witty and pithy. A tough question, but do you have any ideas on how we can attack the demand side of this? As in, what can be done to reduce the number of people who pay for forced marriages?
21 Ben Randall. Awareness is key. A lot of the men buying these women, and funding the entire system, are actually ignorant of what they're doing, and what a devastating effect they're having on these girls and their families. We've had the documentary translated into the local languages, Vietnamese, Hmong, the girls' own language, and Chinese, so that it can make a difference where it is needed most. Unfortunately, we're limited as to what we can do with the Chinese version, since one of my friends still remains in China with the man who bought her.
Ryan Ujnas, did you get help from Chinese officials?
21 Ben Randall. I approached the authorities at one point to find out what support they would be able to provide, but they wanted the full details of my friends before they would tell me anything. It was unclear what would happen to my friends, to their daughters, and to their husbands. My friend was afraid of what might happen and, at her request, I didn't pursue the matter any further.
Sweet Summerchild 97, has your life been threatened in any way because of the work you do?
21 Ben Randall, yes, it has. I've received 2 death threats, and 1 in direct connection with my efforts to find and rescue my friends. Oddly enough, it came from the family of one of the girls I was trying to help. She was desperate to leave China, but her family did not want her back. It was really sad, and only made her situation more difficult.
GB Solo 12, how old were they when they were taken?
21 Ben Randall, most of my friends in that area don't actually know their ages. They're often born at home in the villages to illiterate parents, and many don't have birth certificates. From the best information I could find, it seems most of them were 15 or 16 when they were kidnapped.
Captain_Slamtastic, what was the most dangerous, challenging part of rescuing your friends after you found them?
21 Ben Randall, the whole process actually turned out to be much more difficult than I'd expected. Some of the traffickers had become aware of my presence during the search, and we lost all communication with one of my friends just before she was supposed to be rescued. Based on what she'd said before we lost contact, it seemed very likely that she was being relocated to be sold again, as a bride or prostitute, we didn't know. By that time I felt a huge responsibility for the safety of both girls, and emotionally, that was the most difficult part of the process. It was really tough, not knowing what had happened to her, and not knowing if we'd ever find out.
Doomlight, what are some red flags that someone has been trafficked?
21 Ben Randall, that Polaris link you, Mollikins shared is a good one. There's really nothing to add to that. Except the Liam Neeson thing, obviously. I can't imagine how they left that off the list.
Baleen, what kind of people were your friends' captors?
21 Ben Randall, the trade in women is being driven by a shortage of women in China, as a result of the one-child policy. Before I began this work, I'd imagined that it was wealthier Chinese men who were buying the girls, but it was just the opposite. If you're a wealthy Chinese man, you can find a Chinese bride. The men buying the trafficked girls tend to be otherwise unmarriageable, they might be poor, older, physically unattractive, or all of the above. In the case of my friends, they were remarkably ordinary guys. One was a taxi driver. Another was a factory worker with an injured leg.
Spoonfed 276, what kind of precautions do the kidnappers take to ensure the victims do not escape? 6 years is a long time.
21 Ben Randall, the girls are often threatened with murder and sale into prostitution unless they behave. In the case of my friends, they were sold into distant regions of a country where they couldn't speak or understand the language, and had no means of getting help or finding their way home. Often that's enough to stop them trying to escape. At times, the girls are physically locked up in the homes of their husbands.
Turbo_offender, how did you find your friends?
21 Ben Randall, luck and persistence smiley face. It's a long story, but here's the short version. When I first went back to Asia, it seemed impossible. The only hope I had was to identify my friends' traffickers, and to trace my friends' path across the border and through the trafficking network. Fortunately, one of my friends was able to access a phone in China and call her family in Vietnam, so I then had a phone number to work with. Even after I was able to contact the girls, though, they had absolutely no idea where they were. They'd never been to school, couldn't read any Chinese, and had no idea how big China was. It was a long process of narrowing down their location using any clues they could give me, then trying to find a time and place they could safely meet me.
Blueforal, how did you, a white Australian male, I'm guessing here from your accent, make friends with a group of Vietnamese teenage girls who were later trafficked to China?
21 Ben Randall, in 2010, I spent 3 months teaching English in SAPA, Vietnam. The girls were from nearby villages and would come to town to sell handicrafts to tourists, and take them trekking to their villages. There was a group of 10 girls who used to sit on the corner of my street. I saw them every day, we became friends, and stayed in touch on Facebook. Within 20 months, no less than 5 of those girls were trafficked in separate incidents. I first found out when one of the remaining girls messaged me on Facebook about one of the kidnappings.
85_squats, Sirayakun, Bung, Siraboon is a young girl from Australia who went missing. I've always suspected she is a victim of the same human trafficking. She had an online presence in video games and much contact to the online world. Do you have much to do with catching human trafficking on the internet? If not, would you consider delving into that?
21 Ben Randall, although it was sometimes very difficult to live through, the story of my friends is an extremely powerful one which perfectly illustrates many facets of human trafficking. For the moment, our focus is on using that story to raise awareness of what a complex issue human trafficking really is. There are other, and better funded, anti-trafficking organizations which specialize on the technological side of trafficking. Thorn is probably the best known example.
Doofbags, what happened to their children? Thank you for all the amazing work you do.
21 Ben Randall, thanks smiley face. Initially, both of my friends were so desperate to come home they were willing to leave their babies behind in China, with their husbands. Ultimately, one found she couldn't do it, changed her mind, and chose to stay in China for the sake of her child. My other friend did leave her child, which might sound like a horrible thing to do, but really shows what a desperate situation these girls are in. Keep in mind, too, that they were still only teenagers at the time.
Stevo002, how is the local awareness both in China and Vietnam about the situation of child brides? And what generally is the response of authorities you came across on the issue?
21 Ben Randall, the age of consent in China is 14 years old, though I believe there was some talk of changing this. My friends were 15/16 when they were kidnapped and forced into marriage. By Western standards, at that age, it's a child bride. By local standards, it's not. Adult Chinese men have been caught with trafficked brides as young as 12 years old. There was a case, approximately 2 years ago when a Chinese husband was caught with a heavily pregnant 12-year-old who had been trafficked from Vietnam.
Redmokoro, you mentioned being a full-time volunteer. Does volunteer mean that you don't get paid? And I ask this because I think I would have a very fulfilling life doing something similar to what you are doing, but I can only do so if I'm getting paid, or at least being provided lodging, food, and to op or anyone else that does humanitarian work. Any suggestions on how to help humanity if you can't afford to work for free? An edit might be important to clarify that I don't have a degree. When I look at openings for various organizations, they are only accepting trained doctors, teachers, etc. I don't have a degree, but I do have a good work ethic and I learn new skills quickly.
21 Ben Randall, that's correct, I've never paid for this work. I do take a daily living allowance to cover my most basic living costs, which averages less than $25 per day. The amount I take is ultimately up to me. Our work is perpetually underfunded, and I choose to take the bare minimum so I can continue the work as long as possible. Everyone else on the team is a part-time volunteer. I couldn't afford to work for free for 6 years, either. This work has been made possible only by individual donors around the world who believe in what we're doing. Unfortunately, we still have to fundraise ourselves, which takes quite a lot of time and energy we could be spending elsewhere.
Wing03, as a Western-born Asian, I heard stories and caution from older relatives about not traveling and taking young children there. How much danger is actually there for anyone to be kidnapped and sold into labor or marriage?
21 Ben Randall, anyone can be trafficked, and victims come from a broad cross-section of society. Having said that, the vast majority of victims come from the most powerless segments of society, the remote, the poor, the poorly educated. In general, your chances of being trafficked as a tourist are very low.
12INCHVOICES, sorry if I'm way behind on this story, but this is the first I've heard about it. Do you have any published pieces about your story that I can read? If not, please consider writing about this, it sounds like an incredible story.
21 Ben Randall, thank you smiley face. We've just released the film, you can now check it out for $1 at sistersforsale.com, if you're interested. There's a lot to the story we couldn't fit into the film, so I'm now expanding the story as a book. It's going really well, and hopefully will be finished in a few months. The story is also told in bits and pieces on my blog at humanearth.net.
/bold, what can I do, besides donating, to aid in combating human trafficking?
21 Ben Randall, our organization is a team of volunteers from all over the world who, at some point, all asked the same question. They're an awesome group of people. They've each found a place within the organization to fit their skills and interests, and give whatever time they can. If you're interested to get on board, you should get in touch with Katie at thehumanearthproject@gmail.com, mail to thehumanearthproject@gmail.com, smiley face.
Wilburyzadog, I traveled to SAPA region, Nam Kang, in December and find it interesting that the Hmong people are targeted in this way. Are there qualities that the Hmong or other groups of people frequently have in common that leave them at a greater risk of trafficking? I typically think of trafficking happening in high-volume cities, but obviously that's not always the case. Also, is there anything people can do as travelers, tourists to help or hurt these communities? We stayed in a homestay with primarily Red DZAO employees and I couldn't quite decide if I should have even been present in their community or if it was helping provide employment, even though the travel company boasted ethical practices.
21 Ben Randall, apart from being generally poor, poorly educated, and living in remote communities with little access to legal recourse or support services, one factor that makes the Vietnamese Hmong at particular risk is the Hmong custom of marriage by abduction, which can be considered a form of human trafficking in itself, but also facilitates the cross-border trade. Your second question is also a good one. The ethnic minority groups are often exploited by the majority kin people. If you're visiting one of the communities, it's far better to book with a representative of that community, otherwise you might well be taking advantage of those communities. In SAPA, for example, I would highly recommend trekking with an organization like Hmong-family.com, which is a fantastic little company owned and operated by local Hmong people.
Rangson, have you had any kind of interaction with the buyers? I'm from partly rural China and still can't believe all the things that can still happen in such an otherwise beautiful and mostly developed country, and what kind of people were those bad guys?
21 Ben Randall, oddly enough, yes. I did meet the husband of one friend, and with my other friend, I didn't meet the husband, but some of his family. They didn't strike me as bad guys at all, they were remarkably normal people, and seemed largely unaware of what they'd done, and the effects it had. In the cases of my two friends, the husbands had actually been tricked into believing that they were paying a bride price for a Chinese-born girl, rather than buying a trafficked girl from Vietnam. Having said that, they seem to have been given very dubious explanations as to why the girls couldn't speak Chinese, and were perhaps willfully ignorant. When the girls learned to speak a little Chinese and confronted their husbands with the truth, the husbands didn't really seem to care either. They'd paid for the girls and felt that gave them ownership.
Liquid_farts, how are you friends' mental health now? What sorts, if any, of counseling, therapy will they receive?
21 Ben Randall, that's a good question. I supported one of my friends through a period of rehabilitation in Vietnam, as part of which I introduced her to a psychiatrist and encouraged them to speak regularly. It was clear that my friend had been through a great deal. She'd been kidnapped, held prisoner, threatened with all sorts of things, forced into marriage and motherhood against her will, then left that child behind to reclaim her own life. In her culture, however, people tend not to be very expressive of their mental state, and the idea of her talking about any of these things to a stranger was a completely alien one to her. It was really difficult to even get her to go along, and, sadly, I don't think she was sufficiently open to the process to benefit much from it.